Recording in progress.
Okay, Ari, go ahead.
Sam, thank you. There's a bit of an echo.
We have to figure that out. Done. Except we have to unmute Ari.
There we go. All right, everybody. Good evening. I'm Ari Rosenbloom. Some of the people on the line I haven't spoken to in a long time. So I just wanted to say hello. But everyone, this is the next in our continuing series of adult education events. And I wanted to share with you that tonight's shiur is being sponsored by Debbie Kamyoner and Zev Kessler in celebration of the special birthday of Debbie's mother, Vivian Silver. So I wanted to thank you, of course, very much for the sponsorship. And I am guaranteeing you that tonight is going to be a fascinating discussion. And one of the things that makes it fascinating for me is that I get to hear from someone who I've known for a very, very long time. And when I say a long time, I've known Yedida Eisenstat since she was probably in a stroller. And I can tell you that whether it was sitting at her parents' Shabbat table and, engaging with the family and with her dad and her mom in terms of the week's parasha or the issues of the day, Yedida always displayed a great curiosity, and she was always unafraid to ask questions and investigate. And so I knew her in the shul that I davened in as a young man, and then encountered her again when she was on campus at York University, and I was leading advocacy efforts for B'nai B'rith Canada, and was able to include her in a group that we took to Israel for advocacy training. And again, the same things made themselves clear. That she had a great curiosity and was always unafraid to ask questions and stand up, for important issues. I followed her academic career to some degree, and I've always been impressed by what she's done and where she's been. And I'll get into the bio in a minute, but I did want to add one more thing. And that is that Yedida is married to a naval officer who is often on deployment. And one of the things that we always say, or at least I do, when I encounter someone who is, in the military, I say, thank you for your service. But it is not often that the families of people who are in service get the same thanks. And I think that they deserve it. And so I wanted to say to you, thank you, Yedida, for your family's service and sacrifice. So now I'm just going to share with you Yedida's academic background, and I'm going to share it when I can just pull it up here. Bear with me. Here we go. Dr. Yedida Eisenstat is an editorial associate at the Posem Library of Jewish Civilization and Culture. Prior to this, she held visiting assistant professorships, first in the Center for Jewish Studies and Department of Humanities at York University, and then in the Department of Religion and Program in Jewish Studies at Colgate University. She holds a doctorate in Midrash and Scriptural Interpretation from the Jewish Theological Seminary. And so we're going to begin our program. And Yedida, take it away.
Thanks so much, Ari and Sam, for this lovely invitation. You'll be able to tell in a few minutes. I love to talk about Rashi. So just to add a little bit more to Ari's introduction, yes, I studied Midrash and Scriptural Interpretation at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And I really focused on Rashi's Torah commentary. more than anything. And I turned the camera off for me, so I can't see myself, but there should be in the background the best manuscript of Rashi's Torah commentary that maybe we'll get to talk about a little bit later. So just some introduction, though I would imagine many people in this room have studied Rashi's Torah commentary before. Rashi lived from 1040 to 1105 in northern France, and he's best known for his indispensable commentaries on the Torah and on the Talmud. And we'll talk more about his Talmud commentary in a little bit. So for the last 1,000 or so years, really since the composition of the commentary, perhaps 800 or so years, but we'll round up, Rashi's commentaries have become canonical texts in their own way. And I was just telling Sam, Eric Lowy, now the chair of the Bible department at Bar Ilan, has written an excellent book about how it is that Rashi's Torah commentary became a canonical Jewish text, right? It could have been Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, or it could have been Ibn Ezra's Torah commentary, but it wasn't. It was Rashi's Torah commentary. So that's part of the question here of why Rashi's commentary became so much more popular, really, than any other medieval Jewish text. To give you a sense, really, of the outsized popularity of Rashi's Torah commentary is, for example, it was printed as a standalone volume before the Torah was printed, which I think is kind of bonkers. There are approximately 800 or so fragments of manuscripts of Rashi's Torah commentary left from the medieval period. And about 100 or so of them are still pretty complete. That is unprecedented. There are really no other texts that have survived in that volume, which tells us that it was copied really more than anything else. To give you just a sense of the scale of that, Rashi's grandson, Rashbam, also wrote a pretty popular now Torah commentary. It survived in just one manuscript that was published in 1882, and that manuscript was ultimately lost during World War II. So many of you who have studied medieval Jewish biblical commentary in any formal or academic sense probably know that Rashi is credited with being the founder of a new school of Jewish interpretation in northern France that was interested particularly in reading the Bible anew with a focus on the plain or contextual meaning of the text. Rashi often is referred to, and I'll explain why I think this is wrong, as a pashtan, that is an exegete, biblical commentator who's interested in the plain or contextual meaning of the biblical text. But I think that's wrong. I think that's wrong because perhaps approximately 75% of the Torah commentary is drawn from earlier midrashic interpretation, which gets to the methodology that we will use in examining Rashi's texts in a few minutes. So everybody's cameras are off, so I imagine people are doing other things also, but I do see a few people looking at me, so I'll sort of pull the room. I like to imagine one way when I'm teaching undergrads, let's say, that I explain the difference between pshat and midrash, and maybe I won't pull the room. I think of pshat as the naked or unadorned, plain meaning of the biblical text, as opposed to the midrash, which is a much more exciting flavor than plain vanilla. Some people like vanilla, that's fine. But the midrash, as many people probably know, is much more fantastical and creative, and it will sometimes say fantastic things about the biblical text, or imagine all kinds of things into the biblical text that aren't obviously there. Midrash comes from the Hebrew root that means to seek, lidrosh. So for now, let's say that midrash is the meanings of the Bible that are mined and interpreted, the product of rabbinic seeking in the biblical text. One way to think about this is that the rabbis tell us that prophecy ended in Israel at the beginning of the Second Temple period. And then after that, it became the job of the leaders, they're not yet rabbis, of the Second Temple period to continue to mine the biblical text for meaning, to keep it relevant. And so the biblical text is the record of God's revelation, and therefore it is infinitely meaningful. And it was the job of interpreters to keep the text fresh, and that's one of the tasks of the rabbis in their midrashic project. So as I said a few minutes ago, I think that when one studies Rashi as a plain sense or pshat interpreter, they're really missing what he's doing. And one of the things that I would argue that he's doing is he is, in many cases, reinterpreting both the biblical text, but also the midrash. As I said, more than perhaps around 75% of the Torah commentary is drawn from earlier midrash. And so the way that he records it and translates it into his commentary also tells us how he was reading it and how he was connecting it into the biblical text. So with the rest of our time today, I'd like to work through this methodology that I propose with you, which is to look at Rashi's comment and to look at Rashi's source. And I chose some texts on a particular theme for us, and think about what he's doing and how what he does in these cases tells us something about what motivates him and what's on his mind and why he has taken up the project that he has, in this case, of writing his commentary on the Torah. The texts that I chose for this evening are all related to this question of the relationship between the oral Torah and the written Torah. And in order for us to think about this, we have to ask a few other questions. So one of the questions we have to ask is like, why does this matter? Why do I care about how Rashi thinks about the relationship between the oral Torah and the written Torah and what his project is? So one reason is because there's an irony here, which is that the oral Torah, up until a couple of generations before Rashi, up until about the year 1000, was in Ashkenaz transmitted and studied really orally. That is, Rashi records in his Talmud commentary that Rabbeinu Gershom, the most prominent rabbi around the turn of the millennium in Ashkenaz, sat down and wrote out the Talmud. And I would argue that Rashi does that in order to emphasize and preserve the memory that the oral Torah was transmitted primarily orally. And it's important for us to have this in mind because the way that a person encounters a tradition affects how they learn it and whether or not and how it sticks. So for example, if one encounters a Mishnaic teaching in Rashi's Torah commentary, they will study it and learn it differently than if they're studying a Mishnah while they're learning Talmud. Or for the teachers among us, lots of teachers are making assignments now, assigning students projects to make their presentations in TikTok, or to write scripts, or to produce a podcast, right? So the medium of production and the medium of encounter and the medium of study change how one learns and studies and engages material. So Rashi wants his students to remember that the oral Torah was transmitted orally through the first millennium and that there has been a change here. And this change also can tell us something about what Rashi was doing in writing his Talmud commentary. Talia Fishman, in a pretty controversial book, more than 10 years ago now, posits that once a text is written down, after that, that's when commentaries can develop. So the Talmud commentaries that were written in Ashkenaz after the Talmud was written down, including Rashi's, though there was one before that, but his supplants it and we don't have most of it. Rashi is now in his Talmud commentary, fulfilling before that, when it was studied orally, there would always be engagement between a teacher and their study circle of students. And studying Talmud is very different when one studies it with a chavruta and a text in front of them, and when somebody is in the front of a room giving a lecture. And we'll see that in the Torah commentary and the comments that we'll look at together, Rashi really sees that the onus is on the teacher to ensure that their students really, truly, deeply understand the subject of their study. Okay. So I want to spend a minute talking about the history of the Oral Torah and of this concept. This idea of Torah Sheba'al Peh, of Oral Torah, goes back all the way into the Second Temple period. And we know that because the first century historian Josephus, when he's discussing the differences between the major different Jewish sectarian groups, he actually calls them heresies, in the Second Temple period, he tells us that the Sadducees did not hold by, we could say, the traditions of the fathers, but the Pharisees did. And so historians think that these traditions of the fathers that were the distinguishing mark between these two major Jewish groups in the Second Temple period were effectively the precursors to this, what develops among the rabbis as the Oral Torah in the Second Temple, after the destruction of the Second Temple. And it's interesting, I'll just digress here for a second. In the work that I do now for the Posem Library, I'm working on the volume that encompasses the second half of the Second Temple period and the early rabbinic period. And in my own study, I have mostly only looked at the rabbinic material, but it's been very interesting to see the roots of that rabbinic material in other Second Temple literature. So that's just a side note. So that's a plug for the Posem Library. When volume 2 comes out, it can help you draw those lines. Okay, so rabbinic Jews, many of us in this room tonight, believe in a dogmatic sense that when God gave Israel the Torah, when God gave Moses the Torah at Mount Sinai, that he gave both a written Torah and an oral Torah accompaniment. And now, you can look at the sources. Hopefully everybody has the sources in the chat. Does everybody see the sources? Okay, I see some nods. Okay, great. So now would be a great time to open those up. And you'll see that the first source on the sheet is the first Mishnah in Masaka Vote, where Chazal tell us, the sages tell us, that Moses received the Torah at Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the great assembly. They said, okay, what they said is not important to us. For our purposes, what's important is that the rabbis seek to establish a chain of transmission directly, all the way back to Moses at Sinai. And when the rabbis say this, they don't mean just the written Torah, they also mean the oral Torah. Okay, so they are asserting for themselves that the traditions that they are the guardians of go all the way back to the Sinaitic revelation. That is very important. Okay, so they don't actually offer any kind of proof in making that claim in the Mishnah and Avot, but one of the first texts that I want to show you here in the section of texts labeled A on the first page is that the rabbis actually do have a biblical text wherein they find the oral Torah. Okay, so, and here's an excellent example, I think, of Midrash. So I see a few faces. Eliza, like a friendly face that I've known for a long time. Would you like to unmute and read for us in a language of your choice?
Hold on. I'm not gonna lie. I am also doing work while I'm listening. So if you tell me where you want me to go.
Your camera's on. Okay. The Exodus 34:27, the second text.
Give me 1 second. It's open. It is taking me a second to open again. have to save this to my computer. If Aryeh Jesselson, who's an excellent reader, wants to read, he's a friendly face to me. But you just have to unmute. Can someone unmute Aryeh?
No, still can't hear. Okay. Aryeh, we cannot hear you because your mic is off. So I'm just going to go ahead and read. But people can, unmute. And also, if you have...
Can you hear me now?
Oh,
yes.
Now we can hear you. Please, will you read for us?
And Yedida, if I could just mention before, and Aryeh, before you start, I know that somebody asked for the materials are in the chat. If you take a look in the chat and download the PDF, you'll see the sources.
So which part do you want me to read?
The
second text on the first page.
So ויאמר השם אל משה, כתוב לך את הדברים האלה, כי על פי הדברים האלה קראתי איתך ברית ואת ישראל. דרש רבי יהודה בר נחמני מתורגמני דרבי שמעון בן לקיש. כתוב לך את הדברים האלה, וכתיב כי על פי הדברים האלה. הכיצד? דברים שבכתב אי אתה רשאי לאומרן על פה, דברים שבעל פה אי אתה רשאי לאומרן בכתב. דבי רבי ישמעאל תנא, אלה אתה כותב ואי אתה כותב הלכות. אמר רבי יוחנן, לא קראת הקדוש ברוך הוא ברית עם ישראל אלא בשביל דברים שבעל פה, שנאמר כי על פי הדברים האלה קראתי איתך ברית ואת ישראל. You want me to go on?
Hello? We may have lost Yedida.
I think we have.
Her Wi-Fi was getting spotty there.
Okay. Let's just see where we're at.
That was beautiful reading, though. Sorry I volunteered you, Aryeh.
Yes, she's not on at the moment. Bear with us. We'll get her back. Okay. Sorry for the technical difficulties, everyone.
The glitch.
If Sam is still on, could he check the waiting room? Maybe she's trying to get back in. No.
You have the same access because you're co-host, so you'll be able to see as well.
Yeah. Let's just pause here for a minute. Just going to try and reach out to her. Is Shalom still on? I think he probably
Shalom
is.
Eisenstat?
He is. Yes. Yes. Shalom. If you're on, I don't have Yedida's phone number. But you do.
Okay.
Could you check in with her, please?
I'm trying to.
Bear with us, everyone. Won't be long.
Let's hope she's not speaking into the ether.
Right, she probably is. So duty is on.
Coming on now. She's coming on now.
Great, thank you.
Still not. No, you won't.
Okay, I believe she's on.
How's that?
Okay, now we see you.
All right, I'm mortified. My computer's, I'm on my phone now. My computer is telling me that I have no internet. Yeah, all right, I'll just leave it there, but I am appropriately mortified. Okay. Getting back into the text. Thank you, Ari, for reading. Apologies again. Okay, so what I want to highlight, and this might be familiar to some folks, is that so this verse serves as the basis for the proof text for finding the oral Torah within the Torah itself. And the midrashic basis for this is that God in Exodus 34:27, this is after the episode with the golden calf and after Moses has gone back up the mountain and asked God for forgiveness and been up there for another 40 days. He comes back down with the second set of tablets. So this is in the course of writing those second set of tablets. And I realize now that I have to plug my phone in or my phone's going to die. I'll be right back.
I wouldn't do any better.
Which I can't do.
I guess she's in Israel.
Gabi, can you grab my, I'm gonna have to plug in and broadcast from the kitchen. Here we go. The oral Torah, God says, write these words. And that's the written Torah. And it also said, the Torah says also, ki al pi hadvarim ha'ela, right? So in the verse says twice, et hadvarim ha'ela twice. So with respect to the written ones, that's obviously the written Torah. And there's a pun here, ki al pi hadvarim ha'ela, according to the mouth, according to the words, is the oral Torah. And the interesting drush here also is that it's possible then to read the verse as saying that it is the oral Torah that is the basis of the covenant with God and Israel, which is a pretty radical claim. And we'll see that in the Talmud that I think Ari Jesselson read a minute ago. So what we're about to look at is a very important passage from the Talmud that talks about the distinction between these two different kinds of Torah. So Rabbi Yehuda bar Nachmani, the interpreter of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, expounded. It is written, write down these words, and this is the midrash that I just told you. And it is also written for according to these words. How is this so? And here we get a halachic teaching. Written words, you may not say them from memory. Oral words, you may not say them in writing. So one thing that's fascinating here is we see that the Gemara is establishing that we're supposed to study these different kinds of Torah differently. There are different rules around how we engage the written Torah and the oral Torah. So for example, I would imagine many of us say Shema from memory at night. We're really not supposed to do that. Every time you recite biblical verses, you're supposed to have a text in front of you. But what this is saying also is that for oral Torah, for oral teaching, for Mishnah, Gemara, Midrash, you're not allowed to have a text in front of you. And I would say that, whenever I'm going to, teach anything to Rashi Baal Peh, I make sure that I'm going to have a text in front of you. So you're not actually allowed to. So here we have that in, a really early teaching. So next we have another teaching from the house of Rabbi Yishmael, another really early Tannaitic teaching. And here, Rabbi Yishmael says these, right? So you write, right? So the written words you write, that is scripture, Tanakh, but you do not write halachot. So here, halachot means the practices, right? So that would, for example, be a Mishnah. You're not allowed to write those down. What we do know historically is that teachers would have the Oral Torah written, but they would use it as what scholars call an aide de memoire, really a text to refer to, but one that you're not allowed to teach from. Okay, so now on to the third teaching. Rabbi Yochanan taught, the Holy One, blessed be he, God, only established a covenant with Israel for the sake of the oral matters, as it is written, for according to these words, I established a covenant with you and with Israel. So here, according to Rabbi Yochanan, he makes this drastic claim that God, the whole covenant, the basis of the covenant, forget the written Torah, it's really only for the oral Torah, which is a bonkers claim. And we could look at this and try to figure out who Rabbi Yochanan perhaps was polemicizing with. But, is it the early Christians who reject the Torah? Probably not, because he's, maybe it could be, but it also could be Jews who are debating the Oral Torah and the presence of it in the tradition, because these matters were not settled yet in the 3rd century. Okay. So now we move on finally to Rashi's comment. And here you'll see the methodology here, which is to look at Rashi's comment and figure out how he is thinking about the earlier rabbinic texts. So Rashi, of course, he knows this Gemara. And here, as he sort of states ironically, Et ha'devarim ha'ela, commenting on this verse from the Torah, V'lo ata rishai lichtov Torah she'ba'al peh, but you are not permitted to write down the oral Torah. And I would argue that this is ironic because that's exactly what he's doing, right? The Oral Torah is, the majority of the content of his Torah commentary. So given that it's the vast majority of the Torah commentary, he is himself inscribing the Torah she'ba'al peh in between the words of the Torah. And in doing that, he is violating this very principle that he is recording here. So I think that's, haha, funny. Okay, so we move on. So I think also it's interesting, and this touches on this question of the extent to which Rashi is engaging with Christians and Christianity and has Christianity on his mind. And I would argue very little, but that is a subject for later in the Q&A. He does not include the teaching that the radical teaching that the basis of God's covenant with Israel is the Oral Torah. So I would argue that if he was interested in polemicizing against Christianity, he would make that claim here, but he does not. So you can ask me more about that later if you're interested. Okay. So we move on here. So let me pause here for any questions, which you'll have to, use the hand raising feature to do that, because I only see 4 of you because I'm on my phone, because nothing is working. Okay. There's no internet on my computer. Okay. Okay. So we move on now to the second group of texts. And we start by reading the biblical verse. Ve'ela hamishpatim asher tasim lifnehem. These are the mishpatim, the judgments, the rules that you shall set before them. So Rashi, like the rabbis before him, also is, where he is echoing them, is picking up on this perhaps bizarre language of Asher Tasim Leifnehem, that you will set before them. And here in his comment, he draws from the Mechilta, which is a sort of mid-3rd century midrashic collection on the book of Shmot, Exodus. And here, the Mechilta records this teaching, and I'll read it in English, and I will embellish a little bit. So Rabbi Akiva taught, and these are the rules. So here's Rabbi Akiva's midrash on Ve'ela HaMishpatim. Why is this said? Why does the Torah say it this way? Because the Torah says, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, because we have this other verse in Vayikra, in the 1st chapter, verse 2, that says, speak to the children of Israel and say to them. From here, if I only had that verse, one would only know to teach them once, right? So if I only had the verse in Vayikra, I would think that a teacher can just say the verse and move on and be done with it. So the Midrash continues, from whence do we learn, from where in the Torah do we learn to repeat the teaching 3 or 4 times until the students will learn it? The Torah says in Devarim 31:19, and teach it to the children of Israel. Perhaps this means to teach them and not to repeat. Therefore, the Torah says, place it in their mouths. Sim b'fihem. Perhaps this means to repeat, but they need not know it. Therefore, the Torah says, and these are the rules that you shall set before them. And now Rabbi Akiva explains what that means. Set before them like a set table, like the matter of which it is written, you have been shown to know. So here, Rabbi Akiva explains why the Torah uses this language of Asher Tasim Lifnehem, that you will set before them, so that it's a metaphor for accessibility. And here you can see also that this is, the Hebrew of it is Lifnehem, before them, K'Shulchan Aruch. And here, this must be the origin of the term Shulchan Aruch, like the set table, the 16th century law code that is written to be very accessible. That is to say that what Rabbi Akiva is after here is this pedagogical principle that it is absolutely up to the teacher to ensure not only that students memorize the text or that they hear it once, but that it's actually accessible to them, that they really know it, and that they can access it. So now we're about to see how Rashi translates this midrash into his Torah commentary and what is important in this midrash that makes it into Rashi's Torah commentary. So Rashi reads that you shall set before them, Asher Tasim Lifnehem. The Holy One said to Moses, let it not occur to you. Right, so God is talking to Moshe about how he's going to deliver all of the laws, right? This is the beginning of Parshat Mishpatim, law after law after law to Israel. So God says to Moses, let it not occur to you, right? Don't even let the thought occur to you that I will repeat the chapter to them 2 or 3 times until it is set in their mouths according to its repetition. And I will not trouble myself to bring them to understand the meaning of the matter and its explanation. For this reason, it is said that you shall set before them like a prepared table, before a person ready to be eaten from. So Rashi has paraphrased the Midrash. He's not interested in the sort of verse play, I would call it, that Rabbi Akiva is jumping all over and he's taking all these verses in the Torah that like mean related things and sort of weaving together this drasha. But Rashi in this case is just taking the punchline, right? He's taking the punchline and saying that God is telling Moshe that he has to be a really good teacher. And the other thing that I think is very interesting about Rashi's language here is he's talking about chapters, right? It's not verse by verse laws, but rather it's almost as if, right, the Hebrew is lo ta'ala al da'acha, don't let it occur to you, lomar eshaneh lahem haperek shnayim shlosha pa'amim. It's almost like God is imagining Moshe teaching them Mishnah. Right? We don't talk about biblical verses as parakim. We talk about biblical verses as psukim, but a parak, we're talking about Mishnah. So you can see here at the beginning, and I'll show this to you even more so in the third text that we'll look at, that Rashi, I would say even more than Rabbi Akiva, is reading Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah as he knows it, back into the biblical text and retrojecting it in sort of inserting it into the biblical text in a way that it is not obviously there. Okay, so the last text that I want to show you is one of my favorites because I felt like when I found it, I had, I don't know, stumbled upon gold, I would say. And this last text, there's a bunch of verses at the end of Exodus 34. Again, this is sort of the end of the second giving of the tablets. And the very end of Parshat Kitisa is where these verses appear. And right, the text describes that God was up with Moses for 40 days and 40 nights, and he ate no bread and drank no water, and he rewrote the tablets. And when Moshe comes down the mountain, his face is shining, and everybody's afraid of him, and everybody backs away. There's discussion in the sources about, so Moshe, when he would encounter God or when he was delivering God's word, he would unveil himself, but otherwise from this point on, he kept himself veiled. But at the end of this description, starting in verse 31, the text says, "But Moses called to them, and Aaron and all the chieftains in the assembly returned to him, and Moses spoke to them. Afterward, all the Israelites came near, and he instructed them concerning all that the Lord had imparted to him on Mount Sinai." Okay. And so the Babylonian Talmud, the Bavli, in Eruvin in 54b asks this great question. How was the transmission of the Mishnah organized, right? How was the Mishnah transmitted? Really, we're going to say taught to Moses. How did that work? And so the Talmud answers that Moshe learned, imagine all of the Mishnah from the mouth of the all-powerful one, that is God. And then Aaron entered, and Moshe taught him his lesson. I'm on the text at the top of page 3 in the handout. Aaron entered and Moses taught him his lesson. And then after Aaron was done being the primary student, right? We're talking about Oral Torah here because we're talking about Mishnah. After Aaron has learned his parak, Aaron gets up and moves to Moshe's other side. And then new students come in and sit to the right of Moshe, and they learn their parak, and then they move to the other side. And in the course of this very choreographed study, chapter by chapter, everybody hears the text 4 times, and everybody witnesses the teaching of the text 4 times. So everybody gets to hear it and absorb it and process it and presumably ask their questions and make sure that they understand it, and then they move aside. And this really serves as a model also for the preservation of the oral text unchanged, right? Because enough people have heard it, enough people have witnessed its teaching, enough people have made sure that they understand it, that the text should be preserved reasonably well. So the Babylonian Talmud concludes, "It thus followed that Aaron heard the lesson 4 times, his son 3 times, the elders twice, and the entire nation once." At this stage, Moses moves aside, right? And then Moshe, the primary teacher, gets up and leaves the room. And then Aaron and his sons and the elders go over the text without Moshe also present to supervise. And this is the description that the Talmud gives for how the Mishnah was initially transmitted. And one thing that you may notice about this Talmudic text that we just read, this Gemara, is that it's not exegesis. It's not interpreting the biblical text. It doesn't quote any biblical verses, right? It's talking about an episode that the rabbis imagine happened at the giving of the Torah. And it makes no reference to the verses at the end of Exodus 34. But then here comes along Rashi, and he does this on very rare occasions, but I love it when he does. And he takes this Gemara that is not exegesis, and he reads it back into the biblical text. It's not midrash, but he makes it midrash. And he reads it into these verses at the end of Exodus 34. And here we have, he quotes it nearly verbatim, in the last text on the page. After Moses taught the elders, he went back and taught the passage or the halakha to all of Israel. Our rabbis taught, here he quotes it, how did he order the Mishnah? Moses would learn it directly from the Mighty One. Aaron would enter, Moses would teach him his chapter. Aaron would get up and sit to the left of his son, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he describes again this choreography of how the Mishnah was initially transmitted. And so what's especially noteworthy about this is that Rashi's coming along and he's almost forcing this rabbinic idea of the Oral Torah and its transmission from Sinai that we do find in the major work of the Oral Torah, the Babylonian Talmud, and he is weaving it back into the biblical text that it originally had nothing to do with. And I think that tells us that Rashi was especially interested in sort of putting the Oral Torah back into the written Torah. And I think that also tells us something about what Rashi's ultimate overall project in writing the Torah commentary was, which I argue is that he was proving that one cannot study the written Torah without the Oral Torah, that it doesn't make sense. And that is a contentious point in the 11th century in Northern Europe, because that's exactly what Christians purport to do. Christianity, and I don't think this is a polemical question, and I can make this distinction. Christianity rejects the Oral Torah. And one of its claims about Jews at this time is that Jews misunderstand their own scripture. If Jews understood their scripture, then they would find Jesus everywhere and all over it. But they don't. Jews instead have this completely other tradition of interpretation. And Rashi here is showing, I think, that the ultimate project of the entire Torah commentary is to prove that the Oral Torah is essential for understanding the written Torah. Okay. That is my presentation. Again, I think that what's important is to keep in mind that Rashi was living at a time when the Oral Torah and its transmission were undergoing a change. He was living really in this moment where he is preserving the memory that the Oral Torah up until recently had been transmitted orally. But I'll confess that this was the case for me until graduate school. Like, we called it the Oral Torah, but I didn't really fully grasp what that meant, that it was transmitted orally for almost 1,000 years. And so what he's telling us also is that the nature of engagement with the Talmudic text is a completely different thing when it's studied orally, as opposed to how people were increasingly studying it in his time around a text, which is how we engage it for the most part also. I mean, we have shir and we'll learn a text this way, but the very fact of the presence of the text changes the nature of the engagement. And what Rashi's Talmud commentary does very often, for those who studied it, is it fulfills the role of the teacher at the front of the room and fills in the information that you otherwise don't have, that the teacher at the front of the room otherwise would have been supplying. And, I especially like it, when studying the Talmud commentary and you get to a Rashi that's helping you explain it. And he's saying, you don't understand this now, but 4 pages from now, this will make sense, right? And he's sort of holding your hand like an encouraging teacher and telling you what you need to know and helping you understand it. And so I think that there's a lot of, there's richness in here for teaching and pedagogy, and how we think about the project of teaching the Torah commentary and also teaching the Oral Torah. Okay, now I would love to answer any questions if there are any, but I will need somebody who has more than 4 people on their screen to field them, please.
Sure. If you have a question, please put up your hand. And if you don't know how to do that, then just go into the chat, perhaps, and put your question there. Okay, so I'll start it off with a question, Yedida, and that is, you mentioned that there was a previous attempt at a holistic commentary, such as Rashi's. Could you expand on that? And could you also perhaps share if in the generations immediately following Rashi, perhaps in other places where, you know, his influence would not have been immediately felt, if there were similar approaches, any other, particularly in the Sephardic world or in the Mizrahi world, of any kind of commentary of this nature, or beginning to be written down and to inject the, you know, the oral Torah back into the written Torah.
Okay, so that's a few questions. So
yes,
let me hold me accountable to make sure I address each of them. Yes, we do have some remnants of an earlier Talmud commentary from Ashkenaz. I think it's called the Mates commentary, but we, I think, have very little of it because so the preservation of medieval Jewish texts is really a miracle at all, but also kind of by fluke. So the texts that we have are the texts that were copied, but also that survived burnings of the Talmud. So Rashi's commentaries became so incredibly popular that people stopped copying other texts because his became the text that everybody wanted to have. And we know that there were sort of two ways to get a text. You could either commission a scribe to do it, and a scribe would produce usually a pretty good text, but often at the end of their manuscripts, they write, sometimes they throw a little shade at the person who commissioned it, and they say something like, you know, any problems with this manuscript, or because I didn't have enough money to buy candles, or it was too dark, or my seat was really uncomfortable. So that's the scribal trajectory, but also people would copy their own texts. So you're also to some extent at the mercy of how good the text that you have, like that your master text that you're copying from is. So we have bits and pieces of an earlier Talmud commentary, but Rashi's really, like, once Rashi becomes as popular as he does, his Talmud commentary overshadows really anything else. And I'd say the same is partially true also for biblical commentaries, in that Rashi sometimes quotes other texts, and we only have those texts really because Rashi preserved parts of them in his Torah commentary. He wrote in the chapter with the red heifer, Paraduma, he has a long section that he quotes from, I think, Rabbi Moshe HaDarshan, and I think we don't have that text elsewhere, but I could be wrong about that. So that's the question about the Talmud commentaries. As for Talmud commentaries in other parts of the world, yes. So Talia Fishman, again, in her controversial book, but I think it's very good. Other people, we can talk offline about that. She sort of maps how, where the Talmud gets written down, what the next thing that happens is that commentary is composed upon it, and that the commentaries that are written on the Talmud mimic the genre of commentary in the surrounding culture. So sometimes you have, I think it's Rabbeinu Hananel in North Africa. His commentary is what we call a paraphrastic commentary, where he writes in prose, paraphrasing the argument of what's going on in the Talmud, which is somewhat different than Rashi's commentary that uses the Dibur HaMatchil, or the lemma, to cue the text that he is glossing.
Okay. If there aren't other questions, I want to follow up with one additional question in terms of, and perhaps you would know about this. Are there any elements of these kinds of commentaries or anything that perhaps wasn't preserved in what we have traditionally looked at as Rashi's commentaries? Anything found of that nature in the Cairo Geniza?
Of biblical commentaries.
Biblical or even Talmudic commentaries.
So I am not an expert on the Cairo Geniza. The guy sitting in the back is. But we do, there are commentaries that precede Rashi. And I would say that the same thing happens with other biblical commentaries as happens with Rashi's Torah commentary, that we know that there were other commentaries written in Ashkenaz, but they don't get copied and they don't get recopied. And so they've mostly become lost. So, all right.
Other questions?
All right. Well, thank you all so much for sticking with me. I apologize again for my mortifying technical difficulties. This is my kitchen. Yeah, so the manuscript that I had up before is the best manuscript of Rashi's Torah commentary. It's called Leipzig 1, and you can find it on alhatorah.org there. That's my commercial for the best manuscript of Rashi's Torah commentary. Back to you.
So I want to say thank you so much for, again, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It was great. And we look forward to, another opportunity, hopefully in person with you and your husband. It will be very nice to have you both as Scotland residents as well in the near future. So that will be very nice. Lastly, we just want to share with you that our next Scotland residence over Zoom will be on Sunday, March 6 at 10 a.m. Eastern Time with Rabbi Simon de Hollander. And actually, he is from Holland. So I guess his last name, where he's from, is, whether it's a coincidence, I don't know, but it's very interesting. And he's going to be speaking about, very timely, of course, Islamic sources that deal with Esther and Haman. So we're very excited as well to hear Rabbi Hollander speaking with us. And then, as you noticed, this lecture the shul was sponsored by Debbie Camille and Zev Kessler. So if you would like to sponsor as well in the near future, the next one or the one in April, May, or June, please feel free to reach out to us and let us know. So again, thank you so much again for everyone who participated. Thank you to Ari, of course, part of the education committee, for making the connection and for facilitating and chairing this shul. And we look forward to many more opportunities. So thank you so much again. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
And all the best. Thank you so
much.
much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you again.
Thank you.